What happens when your quiet hometown becomes the setting for your worst nightmare? Tonight, I'm sharing 11 deeply disturbing experiences from people who discovered that small towns can hide the darkest secrets imaginable. These are real accounts from real people who reached out to share their stories. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more spine-tingling content. Let's begin with Ethan Carter's story from Cedar Falls, Iowa. That will make you think twice about who might be watching you while you sleep. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old, and I've been a mail carrier in Cedar Falls, Iowa for about 6 months now. What I'm about to tell you still keeps me up at night, and I'm honestly not sure if I should even be sharing this. But I need to get it off my chest because I don't know what else to do. When I first got the job with the Postal Service, I was assigned Route 47, which covers the more rural areas on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. It's mostly farmhouses and older homes scattered along winding country roads, the kind of places where you might not see another soul for miles. The pay was decent, and I figured it would be peaceful work, just me and the open road. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first few weeks went by without incident. I got to know the regulars on my route. Mrs. Henderson, who always had fresh cookies waiting. Old Pete, who liked to chat about the weather, and the Morrison family, who ran a small dairy farm. Everyone seemed friendly enough, and I started to feel like I was finally settling into small-town life after moving here from Des Moines. It was in my third week that I first noticed something odd. Every Tuesday, without fail, I would deliver identical unmarked envelopes to 4 different houses along my route. The addresses were 1247 Elm Creek Road, 892 Harvest Lane, 2156 Meadowbrook Drive, and 445 Oak Hill Way. The envelopes were always the same. Plain white, no return address, just a single initial written in black ink where the sender's information should be. The initial was always W. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get weird mail all the time, and it wasn't my job to question what folks were receiving. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice more details that bothered me. The envelopes were always slightly heavier than regular mail, like there was something more substantial than just a letter inside. And they had this strange, almost sweet smell to them, like vanilla mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. The 4 houses that received these letters were spread out across my route, and the people living in them couldn't have been more different. There was Janet Walsh, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, who lived alone with about a dozen cats. Then there was the Rodriguez family, Maria, Carlos, and their 2 teenage kids who had moved to Iowa from Texas a few years back. The third house belonged to Tom Bradley, a divorced guy in his 40s who worked at the John Deere plant in town. And the last one was where the Crenshaw family lived. David, his wife Susan, and their twin daughters, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. I couldn't figure out any connection between these people. They lived in different parts of my route, attended different churches, shopped at different stores. As far as I could tell, they had nothing in common except for these mysterious Tuesday deliveries. The whole thing might have just remained a curiosity if it weren't for what happened on a particularly cold Tuesday in November. I was running behind schedule due to an early snowfall, and by the time I got to the Crenshaw house, it was already getting dark. As I walked up to their mailbox, I noticed that David Crenshaw was standing at his living room window, watching me. There was something about the way he was staring that made my skin crawl. His face was completely expressionless, and he didn't look away even when I made eye contact with him. I delivered the envelope and hurried back to my truck. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention to the recipients of these Tuesday letters. I noticed that they would always come outside within minutes of me delivering them, as if they had been waiting by the window. They would retrieve the envelope immediately, never letting it sit in the mailbox like normal mail. My curiosity was eating away at me, but I kept telling myself it was none of my business. That changed on a Tuesday in December when I found one of the envelopes lying on the ground near the Rodriguez mailbox. It looked like it had been dropped accidentally, and the flap was partially open. I picked it up, intending to just slip it back in the mailbox. But something made me stop. I looked around to make sure no one was watching, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, and when I saw what it was, my blood turned to ice. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my own bedroom, in my own apartment. The photo had been taken from inside my bedroom, close enough to my bed that I could see the details of my face, the way my hair was messed up. Even the book I had been reading before falling asleep, lying open on my nightstand. I stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold it. Someone had been in my apartment, in my bedroom, while I was sleeping, and had taken this picture. But how? And why? And what did it have to do with these 4 random households on my mail route? I quickly sealed the envelope back up and put it in the Rodriguez mailbox, then drove straight home. I spent the next hour checking every lock, every window, looking for any sign of forced entry. Everything appeared normal, but that didn't make me feel any better. I called in sick the next day and installed new deadbolts on all my doors and windows. When I returned to work on Thursday, I couldn't concentrate on anything except those Tuesday deliveries. I started carrying a small notebook and began documenting everything I could about the 4 households. What time they retrieved their mail, whether anyone else was around, any unusual activity I noticed. I felt like I was losing my mind, but I couldn't let it go. The following Tuesday, I decided to watch what happened after I delivered the envelopes. I completed my normal deliveries to all 4 houses, then parked my truck at the end of Oak Hill Way, where I could see the Crenshaw house through some trees. I waited, and sure enough, David Crenshaw came outside within 5 minutes to get his mail. But instead of going back inside, he stood in his driveway and looked directly at where I was hiding. Even from that distance, I could see him smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made me want to start my truck and drive as far away from Cedar Falls as possible. He raised his hand and waved at me, then went back inside his house. I drove home that night in a panic. Somehow, they knew I was watching them. Somehow, they knew I had opened that envelope. And somehow, they had been in my bedroom while I was sleeping. I called the police, but what was I supposed to tell them? That I was receiving mysterious letters on my mail route and someone had taken a picture of me sleeping. They would have thought I was having some kind of breakdown. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone lurking in the corners. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere in my apartment. It was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on wood. I grabbed a baseball bat and searched every room, but I couldn't find the source of the sound. The tapping stopped when I got to my bedroom, and that's when I noticed that my window was open about 2 inches. I always kept my windows locked, especially since finding that photograph. I closed and locked it again, but I knew someone had been there. Someone was still playing games with me. I haven't been the same since that night. I still work my route. I still deliver those Tuesday envelopes. But now I know that whoever is sending them is watching me just as closely as I'm watching them. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in the windows when I make my deliveries, or I notice curtains falling back into place like someone was peeking out. The smell of vanilla follows me everywhere now, and I've started finding small white envelopes slipped under my apartment door with nothing inside but blank pieces of paper. I've thought about quitting, about moving away from Cedar Falls entirely, but I have the terrible feeling that it wouldn't matter. Whatever this is, whoever W is, they've made me part of their game now. And I don't think they're planning to let me go anytime soon. Every night when I go to bed, I wonder if tomorrow I'll find another photograph of myself sleeping. Or if maybe this time I won't wake up at all. My name is Harper Cole. I'm 28 years old, and I work as the head librarian at the Millbrook Public Library in Vermont. What I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I've always loved old books and historical documents, but after what I discovered in our archives, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about my job again. Millbrook is one of those picture-perfect New England towns that looks like it stepped right out of a postcard. We have about 3,000 residents, white steeple churches, maple trees that turn brilliant colors in the fall, and enough local history to fill dozens of books. The library where I work sits right in the center of town, a beautiful brick building that's been serving our community since 1889. When I got the job 3 years ago, I thought I'd found my dream position. Part of my responsibilities involves maintaining our local history collection, which includes everything from old newspapers and photographs to personal journals and town records dating back to the 1800s. It's painstaking work, but I love piecing together the stories of the families who built our little community. Last spring, the library received a donation from the estate of Eleanor Whitman, an elderly woman who had lived in Millbrook her entire life before passing away at 94. The donation included several boxes of documents, photographs, and personal items that Eleanor's family thought might be of historical interest. Most of it was fairly standard stuff, old deeds, family letters, recipes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom of the third box, wrapped in an oiled cloth, I found a leather-bound journal that immediately caught my attention. The journal was in remarkable condition despite its obvious age. The leather cover was deep brown and well preserved, and the pages inside were filled with careful handwriting in black ink. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1952, and it appeared to be some kind of family record or diary. What made it particularly interesting was that it documented a family named the Ashfords who had lived at 47 Birch Street, which happened to be the exact address of the house I'd been renting for the past 3 years. I was excited to learn about the previous occupants of my home, so I took the journal home that evening to read through it more carefully. The early entries were fairly mundane. Notes about daily activities, weather observations, mentions of neighbors and local events. Margaret Ashford seemed to be the primary author, though there were occasional entries from her husband Robert and their 2 children, Thomas and Mary. As I read through the spring and summer entries of 1952, I began to notice something that made me uncomfortable. Margaret Ashford's daily routine, as described in the journal, was remarkably similar to my own. She would wake up at 6:30 each morning and make coffee in the kitchen while looking out the window at the oak tree in the backyard. She would eat breakfast at the small table by the window, always sitting in the chair that faced the street. In the evenings, she would read in the living room, curled up on what she described as the comfortable chair by the fireplace. These details shouldn't have bothered me, but they did because they perfectly matched my own habits. I always woke up around 6:30 and made my coffee while looking out at that same oak tree. I ate breakfast at that same table, in that same chair. And in the evenings, I would read in what was indeed the most comfortable chair in the living room, positioned right next to the old stone fireplace. I told myself it was just coincidence. The house naturally guided people into certain patterns. The kitchen window had the best morning light. The table by the window was the obvious place to eat breakfast, and that chair by the fireplace was clearly the coziest spot in the living room. But as I continued reading, the similarities became more specific and more disturbing. Margaret wrote about her habit of checking the lock on the front door 3 times before bed, something I had done every night since moving in without really thinking about why. She mentioned always leaving a glass of water on her nightstand and keeping a small flashlight in the drawer of the table by her bed. She described how she would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and walk to the kitchen for a snack, usually around 2:30 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. Every single one of these details matched my own behavior exactly. I began to feel like I was reading about my own life, written decades before I was even born. The feeling was so unsettling that I almost stopped reading the journal altogether. But something compelled me to continue. The entries from late summer 1952 took a darker turn. Margaret began writing about strange noises in the house at night. Footsteps in the hallway when everyone was supposed to be asleep, and doors that would be found open in the morning despite being locked the night before. She described a growing sense of unease, a feeling that someone was watching the family even when they were alone in their own home. In September 1952, Margaret's entries became increasingly frantic. She wrote about finding muddy footprints on the kitchen floor that didn't match any of their shoes, about seeing a figure standing in their backyard at night, about hearing whispers coming from the walls themselves. Her husband Robert thought she was having some kind of nervous breakdown. But Margaret insisted that something evil had taken up residence in their house. The final entry in the journal was dated October 13th, 1952. Margaret's handwriting was shaky and difficult to read, but I managed to make out most of it. She wrote that whatever was in their house had grown stronger and more bold. It was no longer content to simply watch and whisper. She had seen it clearly for the first time the night before. A tall, thin figure with no face standing at the foot of her bed. Robert and the children couldn't see it, but Margaret knew it was there, and she knew it meant to harm her family. The entry ended abruptly with the words, "It knows I can see it now. We have to leave tonight before it's too late." I immediately went online to research what had happened to the Ashford family. It didn't take long to find the newspaper article from October 14th, 1952. The entire family had died in a house fire that had apparently started in the middle of the night. The fire department's investigation concluded that it had been caused by a faulty electrical wire in the basement. But they couldn't explain why none of the family members had tried to escape. All 4 bodies were found in their beds, as if they had simply never woken up despite the smoke and flames. Reading about their deaths gave me chills, but I tried to rationalize what I had learned. The journal was clearly the record of a woman who had been suffering from some kind of mental illness. The similarities between Margaret's routine and my own were just coincidences, nothing more. Old houses created certain patterns of behavior in their occupants. There was nothing supernatural or sinister about it. But that night, as I lay in bed in the same room where Margaret Ashford had died, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every sound seemed amplified, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the trees outside, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Around 2:30 in the morning, I found myself wide awake with an inexplicable craving for a snack. I got up and walked to the kitchen, moving through the dark house with the familiarity of someone who had lived there for years. But as I reached for the light switch, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were muddy footprints on the kitchen floor, leading from the back door to the spot where I was standing. The prints were large, much bigger than my own feet, and the mud was still wet. I turned on the light and examined the prints more carefully. They definitely hadn't been there when I went to bed, and I lived alone. The back door was locked just as I had left it, but somehow someone had been inside my house. Someone had walked through my kitchen in the middle of the night, leaving behind these impossible footprints. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat and jumping at every sound. When morning came, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the history of my house more thoroughly. What I found made me wish I had never opened that journal. The house at 47 Birch Street had a long history of unexplained deaths and disappearances. The Ashfords were just one of several families who had met tragic ends while living there. In 1923, a young couple named the Hendersons had been found dead in their bed with no apparent cause. In 1967, a widow named Dorothy Mills had simply vanished one night, leaving behind all her possessions and no trace of where she might have gone. In 1985, a family named the Washingtons had fled the house in the middle of the night, claiming it was haunted, only to die in a car accident less than a mile away. The pattern was always the same. Families would move in, establish routines that seemed to mirror those of previous occupants, and then something terrible would happen. The house wasn't just influencing behavior. It was trapping people in the same patterns, the same fate, over and over again. I realized that by reading Margaret's journal, by following in her footsteps so closely, I had somehow connected myself to whatever dark presence inhabited the house. The muddy footprints were just the beginning. Soon I would start hearing whispers in the walls, seeing figures that shouldn't be there, experiencing the same growing terror that had consumed every family before me. That afternoon, I packed everything I owned and left Millbrook forever. I never went back to the library, never returned the journal to the archives. I destroyed it, burned every page, hoping to break whatever connection had been formed. I moved across the country to Oregon, found a new job, started a new life. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I still wake up at 2:30 with an inexplicable craving for a snack. And when I walk to the kitchen, I can't help but look down at the floor, terrified that I might see muddy footprints that shouldn't be there. Because I know now that some houses never let their occupants truly leave, and some patterns are impossible to break. My name is Noah Bennett. I'm 41 years old, and I've been running Bennett's Auto Repair in Harmony, North Carolina for the past 15 years. It's a small shop on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where folks bring their trucks when they need honest work at fair prices. I've always prided myself on being straightforward with my customers, never trying to oversell them on repairs they don't need. But what I discovered 6 months ago has shaken me to my core. And I'm not sure I'll ever be able to look at my job the same way again. Harmony is the kind of small town where everybody knows everybody, and most of the families have been here for generations. We've got about 2,800 people, one main street with a few shops and restaurants, and plenty of farmland stretching out in all directions. My shop sits right where the main road turns into Highway 49, so I get a good mix of locals and folks just passing through. It's been a decent living, and I've never had any reason to complain about the work or the people. The whole thing started in late March when I began noticing something odd about the vehicles coming from the Whitmore farm. The Whitmores own about 500 acres about 10 miles north of town, and they've been farming that land since the 1940s. Old man Whitmore passed away about 5 years ago, and now it's run by his son Dale and Dale's wife, Patricia. They're quiet people, keep to themselves mostly. But they've always been good customers. What caught my attention was that every vehicle that came from their farm over the course of about 3 weeks had the same unusual problem. Whether it was Dale's pickup truck, Patricia's sedan, or the farm equipment they'd bring in for repairs, I kept finding human teeth embedded in the tire treads. Not just 1 or 2 teeth, but multiple teeth, molars and incisors, embedded so deeply in the rubber that they had to be pried out with pliers. At first, I thought it might be some kind of bizarre coincidence. Maybe there was construction happening near their property, or perhaps they were driving through an area where there had been some kind of accident. I didn't want to embarrass them by asking about it directly, so I just quietly removed the teeth and went about my business. But as the weeks went by, and more vehicles from the Whitmore farm kept coming in with the same problem, I started to get concerned. The teeth weren't old or weathered like you'd expect if they had just been lying on the ground somewhere. They looked fresh. Some of them still had traces of blood and tissue attached. They were all different, too. Some were small, like they might have come from children. Others were larger adult teeth, and a few had expensive dental work like crowns and fillings. I started keeping them in a mason jar in my office, telling myself I was probably overreacting, but unable to just throw them away. By the end of April, I had collected nearly 30 teeth from various vehicles belonging to the Whitmores. The whole situation was eating at me, but I didn't know what to do about it. I thought about calling the sheriff, but what was I supposed to say? That I was finding human teeth in people's tires? It sounded crazy even to me, and I was the one living it. The breakthrough came when I was working on Patricia Whitmore's car in early May. She had brought it in because the engine was making a strange knocking sound. But when I got it up on the lift, I found something that made my stomach turn. There were at least a dozen teeth embedded in the tires. But this time, there was something else. Tangled in the undercarriage, caught on a piece of the exhaust system, was a small piece of fabric that looked like it had been torn from a child's shirt. The fabric was bright yellow with little blue flowers on it. The kind of pattern you'd see on a little girl's dress or shirt. It was stained with what looked like dried blood, and there were a few long strands of blonde hair attached to it. I stood there staring at that piece of fabric for what felt like an hour, trying to convince myself that there was some innocent explanation for what I was seeing. That's when I remembered something that had been bothering me for weeks. Over the past few months, there had been several missing person reports in the counties surrounding Harmony. Most of them were transients or people passing through, the kind of disappearances that don't make the front page of the local paper. But a few of them had been local families, including a young couple with a 7-year-old daughter who had vanished while camping in the state forest about 30 miles from the Whitmore farm. I carefully removed the fabric and the teeth from Patricia's car, then spent the rest of the day trying to decide what to do. By the time she came to pick up the vehicle that evening, I had made up my mind. I needed to see the Whitmore farm for myself, and I needed to do it when they weren't expecting visitors. The next Saturday, I told my wife I was going fishing and drove out to the area around the Whitmore property. I parked my truck about a mile away and walked through the woods until I could see their farmhouse and the surrounding buildings. From a distance, everything looked normal. There was a main house, a large barn, a few smaller outbuildings, and several fields planted with what looked like corn and soybeans. I spent most of the afternoon watching the farm through binoculars, but I didn't see anything unusual. Dale was working in one of the fields with a tractor, and Patricia was hanging laundry on a line behind the house. It was such a normal, peaceful scene that I started to feel foolish. Maybe there was some explanation for the teeth that I hadn't considered. Maybe I was letting my imagination run away with me. But just as I was about to leave, I saw something that made me freeze. Dale had finished his work in the field and was walking toward one of the smaller outbuildings, a metal shed that sat about 50 yards behind the main barn. He unlocked the door and disappeared inside for about 10 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying what looked like a large plastic bag, the kind contractors use for heavy-duty cleanup jobs. Dale loaded the bag into the back of his pickup truck, then drove toward the back of the property where the land sloped down toward a wooded area. I lost sight of him behind the trees, but about 30 minutes later, he returned without the bag. He parked the truck, went back into the house, and didn't come out again before I left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that bag, about the teeth, about the piece of fabric with the little girl's blood on it. I knew I needed to contact the authorities, but I also knew they would want more evidence than just my suspicions and a collection of teeth that I probably shouldn't have kept in the first place. The following Monday, I decided to take a more direct approach. When Dale brought his truck in for an oil change, I casually mentioned that I had been finding some unusual debris in the tires of vehicles from his area. I asked if there was any construction or demolition work happening near his property that might explain it. Dale's reaction was immediate and unsettling. His face went completely white, and he started stammering about how he didn't know anything about any debris. He seemed genuinely terrified, but not in the way someone would be if they were innocent and confused. He was scared like someone who had been caught doing something terrible. After he left, I made the decision to call the sheriff's department. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, showed them the teeth and the fabric, and told them about my observations at the farm. Sheriff Martinez listened to everything I had to say, then told me they would look into it. 3 days later, the sheriff's department executed a search warrant on the Whitmore property. What they found in that metal shed behind the barn was worse than anything I could have imagined. There were human remains from at least 12 different people, including 3 children. The bodies had been dismembered and stored in freezers, and Dale had been using his farm equipment to dispose of the parts in his fields. The investigation revealed that Dale and Patricia had been luring transients and travelers to their property with promises of work or assistance, then killing them and disposing of the bodies. The teeth in the tires came from driving over the burial sites repeatedly as they worked their fields, literally grinding the evidence into the rubber. Both Dale and Patricia Whitmore are now serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. The families of the victims finally have closure, and several missing person cases that had gone cold for years were finally solved. But I can't get the images out of my head. All those teeth in my mason jar, that little girl's bloody shirt. The casual way Dale had carried that bag into the woods. I still run my repair shop, and I still take pride in honest work. But now I pay attention to things I never noticed before. I look more carefully at the vehicles that come through my bay, and I ask more questions when something doesn't seem right. Because sometimes the most horrific secrets are hiding in plain sight, embedded in the tire treads of ordinary pickup trucks driven by people who seem like your neighbors and friends. The worst part is knowing that if I hadn't been paying attention, if I had just thrown those teeth away and minded my own business, Dale and Patricia would still be out there, still killing people, still feeding them to their fields, still driving over their remains like they were nothing more than bumps in the road. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a substitute teacher in Riverside, Montana. It's a small town nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors and children still walk to school by themselves. I've been subbing at various schools in the district for about 2 years now, and I generally love working with kids. But what happened at Riverside Elementary last month has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about childhood innocence. Riverside Elementary is a small brick building that serves about 200 students from kindergarten through 5th grade. The staff is close-knit, and the principal, Mrs. Davidson, has always been supportive of the substitute teachers. When she called me in early October to cover Mrs. Chen's 2nd grade class for what was supposed to be just a few days, I was happy to help. Mrs. Chen had come down with the flu, and the kids needed consistency while she recovered. The class seemed normal enough at first. 22, 7, and 8-year-olds, typical energy levels, the usual mix of personalities you'd expect. Some were shy, others were outgoing. A few were clearly the class clowns. I followed Mrs. Chen's lesson plans and tried to maintain the routines the children were used to. Everything went smoothly for the first couple of days, and I was starting to feel comfortable with the group. It was on the 3rd day that I first noticed something unusual during art time. The assignment was simple enough: draw a picture of your family at home. Most of the kids drew typical stick figure families standing in front of houses with triangle roofs and square windows. But as I walked around the classroom checking on their progress, I started to notice that several of the children were drawing something extra in their pictures. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Emma Martinez had drawn her family in their living room, but standing behind the couch was a tall, thin figure with no facial features, just a blank oval where a face should be. When I asked her about it, she said matter-of-factly that it was the man who watches us at night. I assumed she was talking about a family friend or maybe a security guard, so I didn't think much of it. But then I saw similar figures in more drawings. Jake Thompson had drawn his bedroom with his family tucked into bed, and there in the corner stood the same tall, faceless figure. Sarah Kim's drawing showed her family eating dinner, with the mysterious figure visible through the kitchen window. Tyler Walsh had drawn the figure standing at the foot of his bed while his parents slept in the next room. By the end of art time, I had counted 8 different children who had included this same faceless figure in their family drawings. The figure was always tall and thin, always standing in a position where it could observe the family, and always completely without features. When I asked the children about it, they all gave similar explanations. He watches us. He stands by our beds. He comes at night when everyone's sleeping. I tried to approach the subject carefully, not wanting to frighten the children or make them feel like they were in trouble. I asked if this person lived with their families, if he was a relative or family friend. The children seemed confused by these questions. To them, the figure wasn't a person at all. He was just something that was there, like a piece of furniture or a pet. They drew him as naturally as they drew their parents or siblings. That afternoon, I mentioned the drawings to Mrs. Davidson during my planning period. I was careful not to suggest anything alarming. Just said that several children seemed to be including an imaginary figure in their artwork, and wondered if this was something I should be concerned about. Mrs. Davidson looked through the drawings and frowned, but she seemed more puzzled than worried. She said she would look into it and asked me to keep an eye on the situation. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to what the children said during casual conversation. I discovered that the faceless figure wasn't limited to their artwork. They talked about him regularly, but in such an offhand way that adults apparently never picked up on it. During show and tell, Marcus mentioned that the watching man had been standing in his room when he woke up that morning. During a discussion about pets, Lily said her cat didn't like the tall man and would hiss whenever he appeared. The more I listened, the more details emerged. The figure apparently showed up in all of their homes, but only at night. He never spoke or moved much, just stood and watched. The children weren't afraid of him. He had apparently been a constant presence in their lives for so long that they considered him normal. Some of them even seemed protective of him, getting defensive when I asked too many questions. I started to feel genuinely concerned about what was happening. 8 children from the same class, all describing identical encounters with someone who was supposedly watching them in their homes at night. The rational part of my mind insisted that this had to be some kind of shared fantasy or game that had gotten out of hand. Children were impressionable, and once one child started talking about an imaginary figure, others might adopt the same story. But there was something about the way the children discussed this figure that bothered me. Their descriptions were too consistent, too detailed, and too casual. They weren't telling scary stories or trying to get attention. They were simply including this figure as a natural part of their daily lives. And when I tried to suggest that maybe the figure was just a dream or their imagination, the children would look at me with genuine confusion, as if I was the one who wasn't making sense. By the end of my first week with the class, I had started having trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about those drawings, about the matter-of-fact way the children described being watched. I found myself checking my own windows at night, making sure my curtains were closed, double-checking my locks. The whole situation was starting to feel less like a child psychology issue and more like something genuinely sinister. The breakthrough came during my second week with the class. I had asked the children to write short stories about their weekend activities, and several of them included references to their nighttime visitor. But this time, Emma Martinez included a detail that made my blood run cold. She wrote that the watching man had moved from his usual spot by her window to standing right next to her bed, and that he had new pictures that he was looking at. When I asked Emma about the pictures, she said the man sometimes carried photographs that he would look at while he watched the children sleep. She had never seen the pictures clearly, but she thought they showed other children sleeping in their beds. The casual way she described this made my skin crawl. But what terrified me even more was the implication that this figure was somehow documenting or collecting images of the children he watched. That afternoon, I called the police. I spoke with Officer Rodriguez, who had children of his own and took my concerns seriously. I explained the situation as objectively as possible, focusing on the consistent descriptions and the possibility that someone was actually stalking these families. Officer Rodriguez said he would look into it and asked me to document anything else the children said. What happened next confirmed my worst fears. Officer Rodriguez contacted the families of the 8 children who had been drawing and talking about the faceless figure. When he spoke with the parents, he discovered that several of them had indeed noticed signs that someone might be lurking around their properties at night. Footprints in flower beds, disturbed window screens, motion sensors being triggered with no visible cause. More importantly, when the police examined the areas around these homes, they found evidence that someone had been systematically watching the families. There were small clearings in bushes and trees that provided perfect sight lines into children's bedrooms. They found cigarette butts, food wrappers, and even a few photographs that had been dropped or left behind. The photographs were the most disturbing part. They showed children sleeping in their beds, taken from outside bedroom windows. The images were clearly shot by someone who had been watching these families for months, documenting their routines, learning their schedules. The children in the class had been accurately describing their stalker all along. A tall, thin figure who stood and watched them at night. The investigation led to the arrest of Martin Cruz, a 34-year-old drifter who had been living in the woods outside Riverside for nearly a year. He had been systematically stalking families with young children, studying their habits, taking photographs, and apparently planning something much worse. When police searched his campsite, they found hundreds of photographs of local children, detailed notes about family routines, and materials that suggested he was planning abductions. Cruz is now in custody, awaiting trial on multiple charges, including stalking, criminal trespass, and possession of child exploitation material. The families involved have moved or taken extensive security measures, and the children are receiving counseling to help them process what they experienced. But what haunts me most is how accurately the children described their stalker without understanding the danger they were in. They had been living with this threat for months, incorporating it into their daily lives as if it were normal. Their drawings and casual comments had been cries for help that the adults around them hadn't recognized. I still work as a substitute teacher, but now I listen more carefully to the things children say and draw. Because sometimes the monsters in their stories aren't imaginary at all. They're real people doing real harm, hiding in plain sight while adults dismiss children's words as fantasy. And sometimes the only witnesses to these crimes are too young to understand that what they're experiencing isn't normal. That the tall, faceless figure watching them sleep is someone who means to hurt them. My name is Liam Anderson. I'm 52 years old, and I've been the funeral director at Pine Grove Funeral Home in Oregon for the past 18 years. It's a family business that my father started in the 1970s, and I took over when he retired. Pine Grove is a small town of about 4,000 people nestled in the Cascade foothills, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and death is handled with dignity and respect. At least, that's what I believed until 3 months ago when I discovered something that has shattered everything I thought I knew about my profession and my town. Pine Grove Funeral Home sits on the outskirts of town, a stately Victorian building that houses both our chapel and our preparation facilities. We also operate the only crematorium in the county, serving not just Pine Grove, but several surrounding communities. It's honest work, helping families through their most difficult times. And I've always taken pride in treating every person who comes through our doors with the utmost care and respect. The trouble started in late June when I began hearing strange sounds coming from the crematorium late at night. At first, I thought it might be the building settling or maybe some equipment that needed maintenance. The crematorium operates with a sophisticated ventilation system and various mechanical components, so occasional noises weren't unusual. But these sounds were different. They sounded almost like voices, very faint whispers that seemed to be coming from inside the cremation chamber itself. I initially dismissed it as my imagination, or maybe sounds from outside being distorted by the building's acoustics. I'm not a superstitious man, and after nearly 2 decades in the funeral business, I've heard every ghost story and urban legend you can imagine. But the whispers persisted, always late at night when I was working alone, always seeming to come from the same location. The first time I actually investigated the sounds was on a Tuesday night in July. I had stayed late to prepare for a service the following day when I heard the whispers again, clearer than ever before. They sounded like multiple voices, speaking softly but urgently, though I couldn't make out any actual words. I walked over to the crematorium and pressed my ear against the chamber door. The voices stopped immediately, as if whatever was making them had detected my presence. I opened the chamber and looked inside, but everything appeared normal. The chamber was clean and empty, ready for the next cremation scheduled for Thursday morning. I checked all the equipment, looked for any signs of malfunction or unusual wear, but everything seemed to be in perfect working order. I convinced myself that I was just stressed and overworked, maybe starting to hear things that weren't really there. But the whispers continued night after night, always when I was alone in the building. They seemed to be getting louder, more insistent, and occasionally I could almost make out individual words. It sounded like people calling for help, pleading for something. But the voices were so faint and distorted that I couldn't be certain. I started leaving the building earlier in the evenings, but even from the parking lot, I could sometimes hear the sounds drifting through the night air. The situation escalated in early August when I arrived at work one morning to find that someone had been in the crematorium overnight. The chamber door was slightly ajar, which was impossible since I always secured it before leaving. More disturbing, there were what appeared to be handprints on the inside walls of the chamber, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out from inside. I immediately called the police, thinking we had experienced a break-in or vandalism. Officer Thompson came out to investigate, but there were no signs of forced entry, no missing items, and no other evidence of intrusion. The handprints could have been explained as residue from previous cremations or maintenance work. Thompson filed a report, but there wasn't much he could do without more evidence. That night, I decided to stay in the building and try to catch whatever was causing these disturbances. I set up a chair in my office where I could see the crematorium door and waited. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the preparation room, slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully in the dark. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, but when I turned on the lights, the room was empty. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I had heard, the whispers started again from the crematorium, but this time, they were loud enough that I could make out some of the words. "Help us," they seemed to be saying. "We're still here. Please, help us." The voices sounded desperate, terrified, and very much alive. I walked slowly toward the crematorium, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the dead. The whispers grew louder as I approached, and I could definitely hear multiple voices now. Men and women, all pleading for help. When I reached the chamber door, I took a deep breath and pulled it open. Inside the chamber, I saw something that nearly made me collapse. There were people in there, 3 or 4 figures huddled together in the corner, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. But these weren't spirits or ghosts. These were living people, very much alive, who had somehow been trapped inside the cremation chamber. I immediately called 911 and helped the people out of the chamber. They were disoriented and dehydrated, but alive. 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 60s or 70s. As the paramedics attended to them, I tried to understand how they had gotten into the crematorium and how long they had been there. What they told me was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. The 3 people identified themselves as Harold Brennan, Margaret Foster, and William Chen, all Pine Grove residents who had supposedly died and been cremated over the past 6 months. Harold had allegedly died of a heart attack in March, Margaret of cancer in May, and William in a car accident in June. I had handled all 3 funerals personally, had spoken with their families, had prepared the bodies for cremation. But according to what these people told the police and paramedics, they hadn't died at all. They had been sedated and brought to the funeral home while unconscious, then kept in a hidden room in the basement until they could be disposed of. Someone had been switching the bodies before cremation, cremating other remains while keeping these people alive as prisoners. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy that reached deep into Pine Grove's medical and government communities. Dr. Patricia Marsh, the town's primary physician, had been declaring certain elderly patients dead when they were actually just heavily sedated. She would then arrange for their bodies to be brought to the funeral home, where my assistant director, James Crawford, would hide them in a concealed room in the basement. Crawford had been working with Dr. Marsh and several other accomplices to essentially kidnap elderly residents who had valuable property or substantial savings. Once they were declared dead, the conspirators would forge wills and estate documents, transferring the victims' assets to shell companies they controlled. The victims were kept alive because killing them outright would have left more evidence, but they were supposed to be disposed of eventually once all their assets had been transferred. The whispers I had been hearing were the voices of these imprisoned people, crying out for help from their hidden basement prison. The handprints in the cremation chamber were from a previous attempt to dispose of evidence when they thought I was getting too suspicious. The sounds of footsteps were Crawford coming and going at night to check on the prisoners and maintain the charade. Dr. Marsh, James Crawford, and 3 other accomplices are now facing charges including kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and multiple counts of attempted murder. The 3 victims I found are recovering and have been reunited with their families, who thought they had been mourning their deaths for months. Several other cases are being investigated, and it's possible that other victims were successfully murdered before I discovered what was happening. I've had to close Pine Grove Funeral Home temporarily while the investigation continues and the building is processed as a crime scene. The community is still reeling from the revelation that trusted medical professionals and funeral staff were preying on elderly residents in such a calculated and heartless way. Families are questioning whether their loved ones were actually dead when they were cremated. And several bodies are being exhumed for further investigation. The worst part is knowing that I was unknowingly part of this conspiracy. I had trusted James Crawford completely, had worked alongside him for years without suspecting that he was capable of such evil. Every funeral I conducted during this period, every family I comforted, every cremation I performed. I have to wonder now whether I was helping to cover up murders or whether the people I was cremating were actually the victims who should have been returned to their families alive. I still hear those whispers sometimes, even though the building is empty now and the victims have been rescued. I hear them calling for help, pleading not to be forgotten, reminding me that evil can hide in the most trusted and respected institutions. And I know that I'll never be able to work in the funeral industry again because I'll always wonder whether the person on the table in front of me is really dead, or whether they're just another victim of someone else's greed, waiting for someone to hear their whispers and set them free. My name is Abigail Reed. I'm 31 years old, and I've owned and operated Abby's Diner in Brookhaven, Mississippi for the past 7 years. It's a small town of about 800 people in the heart of the Delta, where cotton fields stretch as far as the eye can see and everybody knows their neighbor's business. My diner sits right on Main Street, serving comfort food and coffee to locals who've been coming here since long before I took over from the previous owner. What I'm about to tell you started as curious encounters with unusual customers, but it turned into something that still gives me nightmares. Brookhaven has always been the kind of place where family histories run deep. Many of the families have been here for generations, their roots going back to the town's founding in the 1850s. The diner reflects that history. The walls are covered with old photographs of local families, newspaper clippings about town events, and memorabilia from decades past. Regular customers often point out their grandparents or great-grandparents in the old photos, sharing stories about how the town used to be. The strange visits began in early September. It started with an elderly woman I didn't recognize, which was unusual since I know just about everyone in town. She was probably in her 70s, well-dressed in clothing that looked expensive but somehow old-fashioned, like something from several decades ago. She came in on a Tuesday morning during the breakfast rush and sat at the counter. What struck me immediately was how she ordered. She asked for coffee, black, 2 scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and hash browns. But she specified everything exactly the way we prepared it in 1987. She knew details about our menu and cooking methods that hadn't been used in years, things that even I had only learned about from reading through old recipe cards left by previous owners. When I brought her the food, she counted out exact change from an old leather purse, paying with coins and bills that looked worn but genuine. As she ate, she began talking about people in town, but she referred to them in ways that didn't make sense. She mentioned Martha Henderson's garden being particularly beautiful this year. But Martha Henderson had died in 1994. She talked about how well the Johnson boy was doing in school, but the Johnson family had moved away from Brookhaven 15 years ago. When I gently corrected her, suggesting she might be thinking of someone else, she looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I was the one who was mistaken. Before she left, the woman paused at one of the old photographs on the wall. It showed a group of families at a church picnic from 1987, and she pointed to a younger version of herself standing among them. "That was such a lovely day," she said. "We had no idea what was coming." When I looked closer at the photo, I realized the woman pointing at it looked identical to the person in the picture. But that was impossible. The photograph was over 35 years old. I convinced myself that it must have been a relative, maybe a daughter who strongly resembled her mother. But over the following weeks, more elderly customers began appearing who displayed the same unsettling characteristics. They all ordered food with the same specific knowledge of how things used to be prepared. They all paid with old currency and exact change. And they all talked about current events and people as if they were still living in the past. The second customer was an elderly man who came in the following Thursday. He ordered a meatloaf dinner prepared exactly the way we used to make it in the 1980s, with a specific gravy recipe that had been discontinued years ago. He spent his entire meal talking about the upcoming harvest and how he hoped his cotton crop would fetch good prices this year. When I mentioned that most of the local farms had been sold to large agricultural corporations, he seemed genuinely surprised and confused. Like the woman before him, he paused at the wall of photographs before leaving. He pointed to a picture from a 1983 town festival, identifying himself among the crowd. But again, the person in the photograph looked identical to the man standing in front of me, despite the decades that had passed. By the end of September, I had served nearly a dozen of these mysterious customers. They all shared the same characteristics: elderly, well-dressed in outdated clothing, possessing detailed knowledge of how the diner operated decades ago, and able to identify themselves in old photographs without appearing to have aged. They all seemed to be living in the past, unaware that time had moved forward. What disturbed me most was how they talked about other residents of Brookhaven. They would mention people by name, describing their current activities and circumstances, but they were always referring to people who had died years or even decades ago. They spoke about these deceased residents as if they were still alive, still living in their old houses, still participating in community events that no longer existed. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each visit and trying to identify the people these customers claimed to be. Using old town records and newspaper archives, I discovered that every single one of them had died in the summer of 1987. They had all perished in a catastrophic flood that hit Brookhaven in July of that year, when the nearby Bogue Chitto River overflowed its banks after days of torrential rain. The flood had been the worst natural disaster in the town's history. 15 people died, most of them elderly residents who couldn't evacuate in time. Their bodies had been recovered and buried in Brookhaven Cemetery, and there was a memorial service held every year on the anniversary of the flood. I had attended that service myself several times, never realizing that I would later be serving coffee and breakfast to the people being memorialized. The revelation that my mysterious customers were supposed to be dead should have terrified me. But instead, it filled me with a deep sadness. These people seemed lost, trapped in a time before their deaths, unable to understand that the world had moved on without them. They weren't malevolent or frightening. They were just confused and displaced, trying to return to a life that no longer existed. The situation reached its climax in mid-October when all of the deceased customers arrived at the diner at the same time. It was a rainy Thursday morning, and they filed in one by one until there were 15 elderly people sitting at my tables and counter. They ordered their usual meals and began talking among themselves about events from 1987, completely oblivious to the fact that they were all supposed to be dead. As I served them, I listened to their conversations and began to understand what was happening. They were reliving the morning of July 15th, 1987, the day of the flood. They talked about their plans for the day, mentioned the weather forecast, and discussed the rising river with the casual concern of people who didn't yet know they were in mortal danger. They were trapped in a loop, endlessly repeating the last normal morning of their lives. When they finished eating, they all paid their exact change and prepared to leave. But instead of heading for the door, they stood up together and began walking toward the back of the diner. I followed them and watched as they opened the rear exit, which led out to an alley that backed up to the old riverbed. One by one, they walked out into the rain and disappeared into the gray morning mist. I never saw any of them again after that day. The diner returned to its normal routine of serving local customers and the occasional traveler passing through town. But I couldn't forget what I had witnessed, and I couldn't stop thinking about those 15 people who seemed to be forever trapped in the last morning of their lives. I did some research and discovered that the diner had served as an evacuation shelter during the 1987 flood. Many of the victims had eaten their last meal here before returning home to gather belongings or check on property, never realizing that the river was rising faster than anyone had predicted. They had sat at the same tables where I served them decades later, making the same conversations, eating the same food, completely unaware that they were living their final hours. I still run the diner, and I still serve breakfast to anyone who walks through the door. But now I pay closer attention to the old photographs on the walls, and I've learned to recognize the signs when someone from the past comes looking for a meal. Because sometimes the dead don't realize they're dead, and sometimes they just want to sit down for coffee and eggs one more time in the place where they felt safe and normal before everything went wrong. The flood victims of Brookhaven found their way back to the last place they remembered feeling alive. And for a brief time, I was able to give them that comfort. I just hope they've finally found their peace, and that they're no longer trapped in that endless loop of July 15th, 1987, forever trying to return to a morning that can never be changed. My name is Mason Clark. I'm 38 years old, and I've been a volunteer firefighter with the Clearwater Fire Department in Kansas for the past 12 years. Clearwater is a farming community of about 2,200 people, surrounded by wheat fields and cattle ranches that stretch to the horizon. It's the kind of place where neighbors help neighbors, and volunteering for the fire department is considered both an honor and a civic duty. What I discovered during a series of false alarms at an abandoned farmhouse has changed how I see my quiet hometown forever. The Hendricks farmhouse sits about 8 miles outside of town on County Road 47, a 2-story white clapboard house that's been empty since old Walt Hendricks died back in 2018. The property includes the main house, a large red barn, and several outbuildings, all of which have been slowly deteriorating over the past 5 years. Walt's children live out of state and have been trying to sell the property, but the remote location and the extensive repairs needed have kept buyers away. The false alarm started in late July. Our department received the first call on a Tuesday evening around 9:30 p.m. The automated system at the house had detected smoke and triggered an alarm that was monitored by a security company in Wichita. This wasn't unusual. Old houses with faulty wiring or heating systems can set off false alarms, especially during hot weather when electrical systems are stressed. I was part of the crew that responded that first night. We arrived at the farmhouse expecting to find a minor electrical problem or maybe some smoldering insulation. The house was dark and appeared empty, just as it should have been. We checked the perimeter, tested for smoke or gas, and examined the electrical panel, but everything seemed normal. The security company confirmed that their sensors were functioning properly, so we logged it as a false alarm and returned to the station. The second call came 4 days later, same time of night, same automated smoke detection alert. Again, our crew responded, and again, we found nothing wrong with the house. This time I was more thorough in my inspection, checking every room, every closet, every possible source of smoke or fire. The house was completely empty except for a few pieces of old furniture that Walt's family had left behind. There were no signs of recent occupancy, no evidence that anyone had been inside. By the third false alarm the following week, Captain Rodriguez was getting frustrated. False alarms cost the department time and money, and they take resources away from real emergencies. He asked me to do a more detailed investigation of the property to see if we could identify what was triggering the sensors. I spent an entire afternoon going through the house room by room, testing every smoke detector, checking every inch of wiring I could access. What I found during that inspection was subtle, but it bothered me. There were signs that someone had been in the house recently, despite the fact that it was supposed to be sealed and empty. I found fresh footprints in the dust on the floors, not from our previous visits, because these were different shoe patterns and sizes. There were areas where the dust had been disturbed, as if furniture had been moved. Most concerning, I discovered that one of the basement windows had been tampered with. The latch was broken from the inside, and there were scratches around the frame that looked fresh. I reported my findings to Captain Rodriguez, who contacted the property management company. They assured us that no one had been given access to the house and that all entrances were supposed to be secured. They agreed to have the locks changed and to install additional security measures. But the false alarms continued. The fourth alarm came on a Thursday night in mid-August. This time, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of just checking for fire hazards, I treated the call as if someone might actually be living in the house illegally. I brought a more powerful flashlight and took my time examining every possible hiding place, every area where someone could conceal themselves. That's when I made the discovery that still gives me nightmares. In the basement behind an old furnace, I found a narrow space between the foundation wall and a false wall that had been constructed with scrap lumber. The space was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it led to a hidden room that had been carved out of the earth beneath the house. The hidden room was about 8 feet by 10 feet, with a low ceiling supported by wooden beams. Someone had been living there, and from the looks of it, they had been there for a very long time. There was a mattress on the floor, shelves made from boards and concrete blocks, containers of water, canned food, camping equipment, and battery-powered lights. The space was cramped but organized, like someone had put considerable effort into making it livable. But what horrified me most was what covered the walls of this underground room. There were photographs everywhere, hundreds of them, all showing people from Clearwater going about their daily lives. Pictures of families in their yards, children playing, people leaving for work, couples on dates, elderly residents working in their gardens. Every photograph had been taken without the subject's knowledge, often through windows or from hidden positions. Beneath each photograph was detailed information written in small, neat handwriting. Names, addresses, daily schedules, work hours, family members, personal habits, fears, relationships. It was as if someone had been systematically studying every person in town, documenting their lives with obsessive thoroughness. I recognized many of the people in the photographs, including members of my own family. I found notebooks filled with additional observations about Clearwater residents. The unknown inhabitant had recorded conversations overheard in public, noted when people went on vacation, documented changes in routine, tracked relationships and breakups. There were maps of the town, with houses marked in different colors, schedules showing when different families were typically home or away, and what appeared to be plans for entering various properties undetected. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of personal items that clearly didn't belong to the room's occupant. There were pieces of jewelry, children's toys, family photographs, items of clothing, house keys, and other personal belongings that appeared to have been stolen from homes around Clearwater. Each item was labeled with the name of its owner and the date it was acquired. I immediately called for backup and contacted the sheriff's department. While waiting for additional personnel to arrive, I continued exploring the hidden room and found something that made my blood run cold. There were detailed plans for what appeared to be home invasions, complete with floor plans of houses, notes about security systems, schedules showing when residents would be most vulnerable, and lists of valuable items to target. But these weren't just robbery plans. The notes indicated that the person had been inside many of these homes multiple times, moving through them while families slept, taking photographs, stealing small items that wouldn't be immediately missed, and apparently just observing people in their most private moments. The level of violation was staggering. When Sheriff Martinez and his deputies arrived, we began processing the scene as a crime investigation. The evidence suggested that whoever had been living in this hidden room had been stalking and burglarizing Clearwater residents for years, possibly since shortly after Walt Hendricks died and the house became vacant. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of what had been happening in our seemingly safe small town. The person living beneath the farmhouse was identified as Dennis Wright, a 45-year-old drifter with a history of breaking and entering charges in 3 other states. He had been using the abandoned farmhouse as his base of operations while systematically victimizing our entire community. Wright had developed an elaborate system for monitoring and infiltrating homes throughout Clearwater. He would spend weeks or months studying individual families, learning their routines, identifying vulnerabilities in their security, and then entering their homes when they were away or sleeping. He had been inside nearly every house in town at some point, stealing small items, taking photographs, and in some cases, simply watching people sleep. The false fire alarms had been Wright's way of monitoring law enforcement response times and patterns. He would trigger the alarms intentionally, then hide in his underground room while we searched the house, timing our response and learning our procedures. He had been using our own emergency response system to better plan his crimes. Wright was eventually apprehended at a truck stop in Colorado, where he was arrested on outstanding warrants from Kansas and several other states. The evidence we found in his underground room led to charges including multiple counts of breaking and entering, burglary, stalking, and invasion of privacy. Many families in Clearwater discovered that their homes had been violated in ways they never realized. I still volunteer with the fire department, and I still respond to calls at abandoned or vacant properties. But now I know that empty houses aren't always empty, and that some of the most dangerous predators are the ones who remain invisible, watching and waiting from places we never think to look. The Hendricks farmhouse has since been demolished, but sometimes I still wonder how many other hidden rooms exist beneath the houses and buildings of small towns across America, sheltering people who have made careers out of violating the privacy and security of innocent families. The scariest part is knowing that Dennis Wright had been living among us for years, learning our secrets, invading our homes, and documenting our lives, all while we went about our daily routines completely unaware that we were being watched by someone who saw us as nothing more than subjects to be studied and victimized. My name is Ella Foster. I'm 26 years old, and I work as a bank teller at First National Bank of Millfield in Ohio. Millfield is a small town of about 200 people, the kind of place where farmers still come into town on Saturday mornings, and everyone knows each other by name. I've been working at the bank for 4 years now, and I thought I had seen every type of customer you could imagine. But what I discovered about one particular elderly woman has shaken my understanding of my quiet hometown to its core. First National Bank sits right on Main Street in a brick building that's been serving our community since 1923. We're a small operation with only 6 employees, and most of our customers have been banking with us for decades. I handle routine transactions, help people with their accounts, and try to provide the personal service that you can't get at the big corporate banks in larger cities. It's steady work, and I enjoy the daily interactions with people I've known most of my life. The woman I'm going to tell you about first caught my attention in early August. Her name, according to her account, was Dorothy Crane, and she appeared to be in her 80s. She was small and frail, always dressed in clothing that looked expensive but outdated, like something from the 1960s or 1970s. What made her memorable was her routine. She came in every Friday at exactly 10:15 a.m. to make a deposit, and she always followed the same precise pattern. Mrs. Crane would approach my window with a small black purse and a manila envelope. She would carefully count out exactly $847 in cash, always in the same denominations: 7 $100 bills, 2 20s, 1 5, and 2 1s. The bills were always old and worn, like they had been circulating for decades. She would make her deposit, ask for her balance, thank me politely, and then leave without any other conversation. What struck me as odd was that Mrs. Crane never used checks, credit cards, or any modern banking services. She only dealt in cash, and she always deposited the exact same amount every week. When I checked her account history, I discovered that she had been making identical deposits every Friday for over 15 years, never missing a week, never varying the amount by even $1. After a few weeks of these regular visits, I started paying closer attention to Mrs. Crane's behavior. She had some unusual habits that made me uncomfortable. While she counted out her money, she would mutter under her breath, speaking names of people in town. But these weren't casual mentions. She would say things like Martha Henderson, 1987, heart attack, or Robert Mills, 1994, car accident, or Sarah Johnson, 2003, cancer. At first, I thought she might be suffering from dementia or some other age-related condition that was causing her to ramble about people she remembered from the past. Many of our elderly customers talked about old friends and neighbors who had passed away, so this didn't seem particularly unusual. But as the weeks went by, I realized that Mrs. Crane was reciting a comprehensive list of everyone who had died in Millfield over the past several decades. The names she mentioned included people I knew had passed away, but also many names I didn't recognize. She would recite them in chronological order, always including the year of death and the cause. Her memory was remarkable. She never seemed to repeat herself or get confused about dates. She had apparently memorized the death records of our entire town going back generations. What disturbed me most was how she would sometimes mention people who were still alive. But she would speak about them in the past tense, as if they had already died. She would say things like Thomas Bradley, 2019, stroke, or Jennifer Walsh, 2021, pneumonia, referring to people I knew were healthy and active in the community. I began to wonder if Mrs. Crane was predicting deaths rather than just remembering them. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to do some research on Dorothy Crane, using the bank's customer records and some online searches. I discovered that she had opened her account in 2008, around the time she moved to Millfield from another part of Ohio. Her address was listed as 412 Elm Street, a small house on the edge of town that I had driven past many times but never paid much attention to. One Friday afternoon, after Mrs. Crane had made her usual deposit, I decided to drive by her house on my way home from work. What I found was puzzling. The house at 412 Elm Street appeared to be abandoned. The yard was overgrown, the windows were boarded up, and there was a "for sale" sign that looked like it had been there for years. I parked across the street and watched for any signs of activity, but the house seemed completely vacant. I asked around town about the property and learned that it had been empty since 2015, when the previous owner had died without any known relatives. The house had been tied up in probate court for years, and no one had lived there since. This meant that Mrs. Burlwaystout Crane couldn't possibly be living at the address she had given the bank. The next Friday, I paid closer attention to where Mrs. Crane went after leaving the bank. I watched through the window as she walked slowly down Main Street. But instead of turning toward Elm Street or any residential area, she headed toward the old part of town near the cemetery. I lost sight of her when she turned a corner, but her destination seemed to be somewhere in the area of Millfield Cemetery. That weekend, I visited the cemetery to see if I could learn anything about Mrs. Crane. Millfield Cemetery is the oldest burial ground in town, with graves dating back to the 1800s. I spent several hours walking through the older sections, reading headstones, and trying to find any connection to Dorothy Crane. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. In the section of the cemetery reserved for burials from the 1920s and 1930s, I found a weathered headstone that read, Dorothy Marie Crane, 1908-1932. Beloved daughter. The woman who had been making deposits at my bank every Friday for months was supposed to have died 93 years ago. I researched the historical records and found a newspaper obituary from 1932 describing Dorothy Crane's death from tuberculosis at age 24. She had been born in Millfield, lived her entire short life in the town, and was buried in the family plot at Millfield Cemetery. There were no other Dorothy Cranes in the town's records. No relatives who might have shared the name. Armed with this information, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't exactly tell my supervisor that one of our regular customers had been dead for nearly a century. But I also couldn't ignore what I had discovered. The next Friday, I decided to confront Mrs. Crane directly about the discrepancies in her account information. When she appeared at my window at her usual time, I politely mentioned that we needed to update her address information, since our records showed that 412 Elm Street was vacant. Mrs. Crane looked at me with confusion and said that she had lived at that address for many years. When I gently suggested that there might be some mistake, she became agitated and insisted that I was wrong. As she counted out her usual deposit, she began muttering names again, but this time she included mine. Ella Foster, 2025. Accident, she said clearly, looking directly at me with eyes that seemed much older and more knowing than they should have been for someone who was supposedly confused about her living situation. The encounter left me deeply shaken. Over the following weeks, I started noticing other disturbing details about Mrs. Crane's visits. Her reflection in the security mirror above my window was sometimes absent or unclear, as if she wasn't entirely there. The cash she brought always felt unusually cold to the touch, even on warm days. And the other customers in the bank never seemed to notice her, even when she was standing right next to them in line. I began to suspect that Mrs. Crane wasn't making deposits at all, but was somehow conducting some kind of ritual or ceremony connected to the deaths she recited. The money she brought might not have been real currency, but something else entirely. Payment for services rendered, or tribute to some darker purpose. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I researched more deeply into Dorothy Crane's life and death. I discovered that she had worked as a mortician's assistant in the 1920s and early 1930s, helping to prepare bodies for burial during a time when Millfield was experiencing a series of unexplained deaths. The newspaper articles from that period suggested that some people suspected Dorothy of being involved in the deaths. But she died of tuberculosis before any investigation could be completed. I realized that Mrs. Crane was continuing the work she had started nearly a century ago, somehow maintaining a presence in Millfield to oversee and perhaps orchestrate the deaths of residents. The weekly deposits were her way of keeping track of her activities, and her recitation of names was a record of her accomplishments over the decades. I quit my job at First National Bank the following Monday and moved away from Millfield immediately. I never saw Mrs. Crane again, but I know she's still there, still making her Friday deposits, still reciting the names of the dead and the soon-to-be dead. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my name is still on her list, if leaving town was enough to escape whatever fate she had planned for me, or if distance is no protection from someone who has been collecting souls for nearly a century. My name is Oliver Hayes. I'm 45 years old, and I've owned Hayes Hardware Store in Greenwood, Idaho for the past 22 years. It's a family business that my father started in the 1970s, serving the ranchers, farmers, and residents of our small mountain community of about 500 people. Greenwood sits in a valley surrounded by pine forests and snow-capped peaks, the kind of place where people still believe in helping their neighbors and keeping their word. What I discovered about one of my regular customers has forced me to question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the nature of trust in a small town. Hayes Hardware is located on Pine Street, right in the heart of Greenwood's small downtown area. We carry everything from basic tools and building supplies to hunting gear and gardening equipment. Most of our customers are locals who've been shopping with us for decades. And I pride myself on knowing what they need before they even ask. It's the kind of personal service that keeps small businesses alive in communities like ours. The strange situation began in late September when I started noticing unusual purchasing patterns from someone who was stealing from my store. At first, it seemed like typical shoplifting. Small items disappearing from the shelves, nothing valuable enough to justify installing expensive security cameras or hiring additional staff. But as the weeks went by, I realized that the thefts were following a very specific pattern. The items being stolen were always the same types of products and always in identical quantities. Someone was taking exactly 50 feet of rope, 2 shovels, 1 bag of lime, and 3 heavy-duty tarps every 2 weeks. The consistency was so precise that I started tracking the thefts in my inventory log, and I could predict almost to the day when the next theft would occur. What puzzled me most was that these weren't random thefts of opportunity. The items were being taken by someone who clearly knew my store's layout and inventory system. The thefts always occurred during busy periods when I was distracted by other customers, and they were executed with surgical precision. Nothing else was ever disturbed or damaged. And the thief never took anything beyond those specific items in those exact quantities. I decided to install a hidden security camera focused on the section of the store where the targeted items were displayed. The camera was small and well concealed, positioned to capture anyone who approached that area of the store. I didn't tell any of my employees about it, wanting to catch the thief without alerting them to the surveillance. The first few days of surveillance yielded nothing unusual. I watched hours of footage showing normal customers browsing the aisles, making their purchases and leaving without incident. But on the fourth day, the camera captured something that made my blood run cold. The thief was Herman Walsh, a 67-year-old local man who had been shopping at my store for over 15 years. Herman was someone I considered a friend, not just a customer. He lived alone in a cabin about 5 miles outside of town, kept to himself mostly, but always seemed friendly and reliable when he came into the store. He was also someone who should have been impossible to catch on camera, because Herman Walsh had died in a car accident 3 months earlier. I watched the footage over and over, unable to believe what I was seeing. The figure on the camera was definitely Herman. Same height, same build, same distinctive walking style with a slight limp from an old hunting accident. He moved through my store with the familiarity of someone who had shopped there hundreds of times, collecting the rope, shovels, lime, and tarps with practiced efficiency. He even nodded politely to other customers, though none of them seemed to notice or acknowledge him. The most disturbing part was watching Herman approach the checkout counter where I was working, standing just a few feet away from me while I helped another customer. On the security footage, I could see him clearly, but I had no memory of seeing him that day. It was as if he was invisible to everyone in the store except the camera. I researched the date of Herman's death and confirmed what I already knew. He had died on June 15th when his pickup truck went off Mountain Road during a thunderstorm. The funeral had been held at Greenwood Methodist Church, and Herman was buried in Pine Grove Cemetery. I had attended the service myself and had even spoken with his nephew from Boise, who had come to settle Herman's affairs. But if Herman was dead and buried, who or what was stealing from my store? And more importantly, what was he doing with 50 feet of rope, 2 shovels, a bag of lime, and 3 tarps every 2 weeks? I decided I needed to investigate Herman's property to see if I could find answers. His cabin was located on a dirt road that wound through dense forest, the kind of isolated location where someone could do just about anything without being observed. The property had been sitting empty since his death, with his nephew planning to sell it once the estate was settled. The cabin itself was a modest log structure with a small porch and a metal roof. It looked exactly as I remembered it from the few times I had visited Herman when he was alive. But as I walked around the property, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Fresh, disturbed earth in several locations around the cabin, as if someone had been digging recently. The disturbed areas were roughly rectangular, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and they were scattered throughout the wooded area behind Herman's cabin. There were at least 8 or 9 of these sites, all showing signs of recent excavation and backfilling. The earth was loose and darker than the surrounding soil, and there was a faint smell that I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach turn. I also found evidence of Herman's continuing presence on the property. There were fresh boot prints in the mud near the cabin, tire tracks from a vehicle that matched Herman's old pickup truck, and signs that someone had been using the cabin recently. I could see light coming from the windows at night, and there was smoke coming from the chimney on cold evenings. The most disturbing discovery was a storage shed behind the cabin that I had never noticed during Herman's lifetime. The shed was partially hidden by trees and painted to blend in with the forest, making it nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, but I could see through gaps in the siding that the interior was stocked with supplies: coils of rope, shovels, bags of lime, and stacks of tarps. All of the items matched exactly what had been stolen from my store over the past several weeks. But there were also other things in the shed that horrified me. Personal belongings that looked like they had been taken from different people. Clothing, jewelry, wallets, and what appeared to be identification documents from multiple individuals. I realized that Herman hadn't just been stealing supplies for some innocent purpose. He was using them to dispose of evidence, probably human remains, in those rectangular plots scattered around his property. The lime would accelerate decomposition, the tarps would contain and transport bodies, and the shovels would be used for digging graves in the forest. But Herman was supposed to be dead, buried in Pine Grove Cemetery 3 months ago. How was he continuing to kill people and dispose of their bodies? And how many victims were buried in those unmarked graves behind his cabin? I contacted the sheriff's department and reported what I had discovered. Sheriff Davidson was initially skeptical of my claims about Herman being alive, but he agreed to investigate the property based on the evidence of recent disturbances and possible human remains. The investigation that followed revealed the horrific truth about Herman Walsh and what he had been doing in the months before his supposed death. The rectangular plots behind his cabin contained the remains of 7 people who had disappeared from the Greenwood area over the past 2 years. Herman had been luring victims to his isolated property, killing them, and burying them in shallow graves throughout the forest. But the most shocking discovery was that Herman Walsh wasn't dead at all. The car accident on Mountain Road had been staged, and the body buried in Pine Grove Cemetery belonged to one of his victims. Herman had faked his own death to avoid suspicion while he continued his killing spree, using the assumption that he was dead as the perfect cover for his crimes. Herman was eventually captured at his cabin, where he had been living secretly since his supposed death. He confessed to the murders and revealed that he had been planning to continue killing indefinitely, using his status as a dead man to remain invisible to law enforcement. The thefts from my store had been his way of obtaining the supplies he needed to dispose of evidence without creating a paper trail that could be traced back to him. Herman Walsh is now serving multiple life sentences for the murders he committed. The victims' families finally have closure, and several missing person cases that had gone cold were resolved. But I can't forget the image of a dead man walking through my store, stealing supplies for his next murder, invisible to everyone except a security camera that captured proof of the impossible. I still run Hayes Hardware, and I still serve the people of Greenwood with the same dedication I always have. But now I pay closer attention to my customers, and I keep detailed records of who buys what supplies. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we think are dead and buried. And sometimes the perfect alibi is simply not existing at all. My name is Scarlett Stone. I'm 33 years old, and I work as the guidance counselor at Fairview Elementary School in Pennsylvania. Fairview is a small town of about 2,800 people, nestled in the hills of central Pennsylvania, where most families have lived for generations and everyone takes pride in their quiet, safe community. I've been working with children for 8 years, helping them navigate everything from academic struggles to family problems. What I discovered about a group of children from certain families in our town has revealed a dark secret that goes back to Fairview's founding. And it's something that still haunts me every single day. Fairview Elementary serves about 300 students from kindergarten through 6th grade, drawing from the town itself and several surrounding rural areas. As the school's only guidance counselor, I work with children who are experiencing behavioral problems, academic difficulties, or emotional challenges. It's rewarding work, and I love being able to help kids work through the problems that seem overwhelming to them, but can usually be resolved with patience and understanding. The pattern that would eventually consume my life began in early October, when I started noticing that several children from different families were reporting remarkably similar nightmares. This wasn't unusual in itself. Children often share fears about monsters under the bed or scary movies they've seen. But these nightmares were far more specific and disturbing than typical childhood fears. The first child to describe the dream was 8-year-old Emma Richardson. She had been having trouble sleeping and was showing signs of anxiety during school hours, so her teacher referred her to my office. When I asked Emma about her nightmares, she described a recurring dream where she found herself in a basement that didn't exist in her family's house. In the dream, there were other children with her, all sitting in a circle around a pit in the floor. An adult figure, whose face she could never see clearly, would make the children recite words in a language they didn't understand while something moved in the darkness of the pit. I initially treated Emma's nightmare as a typical anxiety response, possibly triggered by something she had seen on television or heard in conversation. We worked on relaxation techniques and coping strategies, and I made a note to follow up with her parents about limiting her exposure to scary content. But over the following weeks, more children began reporting variations of the same nightmare. 7-year-old Michael Torres described being in an underground room with stone walls where children had to hold hands around a deep hole while adults in dark clothing chanted words that made his head hurt. 9-year-old Sarah Bennett talked about dreams where she was led downstairs that went deeper than any basement should go, into a room lit by candles where children were forced to repeat strange words until something answered from beneath the floor. By November, I had documented similar nightmare reports from 12 different children, all between the ages of 6 and 10. The details varied slightly, but the core elements were always the same: an underground chamber, a group of children arranged around a pit or hole, adult figures conducting some kind of ritual, and the sense that something dark and hungry was waiting in the depths below. What made these reports particularly unsettling was that the children came from families that seemed to have no connection to each other. The Richardsons were relative newcomers to Fairview, having moved there only 3 years ago. The Torres family had lived in town for about 15 years. The Bennetts were a local family with roots going back several generations. These families attended different churches, worked in different industries, and lived in different parts of town. I began to suspect that the children might be experiencing some form of shared trauma, possibly related to an event they had all witnessed or a location they had all visited. I started asking more detailed questions about the nightmares, trying to identify common elements that might point to a real source of their fears. The breakthrough came when I asked the children to describe the basement from their dreams in more detail. Several of them mentioned specific features that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. They described stone walls with strange symbols carved into them, a floor made of large flat stones arranged in a specific pattern, and metal fixtures that looked very old and rusty. Most importantly, they all mentioned a distinctive smell in the basement, something like old wood and candle wax mixed with something else they couldn't identify. I decided to research the history of Fairview to see if I could find any connection between these families or any historical events that might explain the shared nightmares. What I discovered in the town's historical records was more disturbing than I had expected. Fairview had been founded in 1847 by a group of families who had been driven out of their previous community in New York State under mysterious circumstances. The historical records were vague about the reasons for their departure, but there were references to unusual religious practices and concerns about the welfare of children. The founding families of Fairview included the Bennetts, the Richardsons, the Torres family, and 8 other surnames that matched the last names of children who had been reporting the nightmares. Further research revealed that these founding families had established what they called the Fairview Brotherhood, a religious organization that practiced rituals designed to ensure the prosperity and protection of their community. The Brotherhood had constructed a meeting place beneath the town's first church, a stone chamber where they conducted ceremonies that were kept secret from outsiders. The original church had been destroyed in a fire in 1923, and a new church was built on a different site. The location of the original church and its underground chamber was now occupied by a small park in the center of town. But according to the historical records, the stone chamber beneath the original church had never been filled in or demolished. It was simply sealed and forgotten as the town grew and changed over the decades. I realized that the children's nightmares might not be dreams at all, but memories of something that was actually happening to them. The families whose children were experiencing these nightmares were all descendants of the original Fairview Brotherhood, and it was possible that the organization had continued operating in secret for over 175 years. I began investigating the descendants of the founding families more carefully, looking for connections and patterns in their behavior. What I found was evidence of a tight-knit group of families who maintained close relationships despite their apparent differences. They attended each other's social events, their children played together regularly, and several of the adults worked in positions of authority within the town government and school system. More importantly, I discovered that these families had a tradition of taking their children on special outings that were never discussed with outsiders. The children would be told they were going to visit relatives or attend family gatherings, but they would return home acting subdued and confused, often with gaps in their memory about what had happened during these trips. I realized that the Fairview Brotherhood had never disbanded. It had simply evolved and adapted to modern times. The founding families were still conducting their rituals, still using children as participants, and still maintaining the secret traditions that had been established over a century ago. The nightmares the children were experiencing were actually suppressed memories of ritual abuse that had been happening to them for years. The underground chamber described in the children's dreams was real, and it was still being used by the modern descendants of the original Brotherhood. The children were being taken there regularly, forced to participate in ceremonies they didn't understand, and then having their memories suppressed or distorted so they would remember the experiences as nothing more than bad dreams. I contacted the state police and Child Protective Services, providing them with all the evidence I had gathered about the Fairview Brotherhood and the ongoing abuse of children from specific families. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what had been happening in our quiet small town for generations. The Brotherhood was still operating with 12 core families, conducting rituals in the original stone chamber beneath the town park. The chamber was accessed through a hidden entrance in the basement of a house owned by one of the founding families, and it had been maintained and used continuously since the town's establishment in 1847. The children who had been reporting nightmares were all victims of systematic ritual abuse that had been disguised as family traditions and community events. The Brotherhood members had convinced themselves that their ceremonies were necessary to protect and prosper the town. And they had been passing this belief down through generations of families. 23 adults were arrested in connection with the child abuse ring, including the mayor, 2 school board members, and several prominent local business owners. 37 children were removed from their homes and placed in protective custody while they received therapy and support to help them process the trauma they had experienced. I left Fairview immediately after the investigation concluded, unable to continue working in a community where so many trusted adults had been involved in harming children. The town has since struggled to rebuild its reputation and restore trust in its institutions. But the damage done to those children and their families will last for generations. The most horrific part of this entire experience was realizing how a dark secret could be maintained and passed down through generations in a small town. Hidden behind facades of respectability and community involvement, the children's nightmares were their minds trying to process and cope with real trauma that had been inflicted on them by the very people who were supposed to protect them, and their cries for help had been dismissed as nothing more than bad dreams. My name is Lucas Mitchell. I'm 39 years old, and I'm the editor and publisher of the Sunset Valley Tribune, the only newspaper serving our small Wyoming community of about 1,900 people. Sunset Valley sits in a remote mountain valley where cattle ranching and tourism are the main industries, and our weekly newspaper has been documenting local events and keeping residents informed for over 60 years. What started as routine newspaper work turned into the most terrifying week of my life when I began receiving obituaries for people who were still very much alive. The Tribune operates out of a small office on Main Street, and I handle everything from writing articles to managing subscriptions to laying out the pages for print. It's a one-man operation most of the time, with occasional help from freelance writers and a part-time assistant who helps with distribution. We publish every Thursday, covering everything from high school sports and town council meetings to ranch news and tourist information. Our obituary section has always been straightforward. When someone in the community passes away, family members contact me with the details, or I receive information from local funeral homes. I write a respectful tribute to the deceased, include service information, and publish it in the next edition. It's one of the most important services we provide to the community, helping families honor their loved ones and keeping residents informed about losses in our tight-knit town. The first unusual obituary arrived in my email inbox on a Monday morning in late August. It was submitted through our standard online form, complete with all the typical information: full name, age, date of death, cause of death, surviving family members, and funeral arrangements. What made it unusual was that it was for Janet Morrison, a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher who I had seen at the grocery store just the day before, looking perfectly healthy and complaining about the weather. According to the obituary submission, Janet had died of a heart attack on Sunday evening at Sunset Valley General Hospital. The details were remarkably specific, including the exact time of death, the names of attending physicians, and funeral arrangements at Patterson Funeral Home for the following Saturday. Everything seemed legitimate except for the fact that Janet Morrison was still alive. I called Janet's house to clarify the situation, thinking there might have been some mistake, or that perhaps the obituary was for a different Janet Morrison. Janet answered the phone herself, sounding perfectly normal and healthy. When I mentioned the obituary submission, she was confused and somewhat upset, insisting that she was fine and had no idea who would have submitted such information. I decided not to publish the obituary, assuming it was either a prank or some kind of administrative error. But I kept the submission in my files, intending to investigate further if similar problems occurred. I didn't have to wait long. Over the next few days, I received 3 more obituary submissions for people who were demonstrably alive. There was one for Tom Bradley, the local mechanic who had worked on my truck just that morning. Another was for Maria Santos, who ran the town's only Mexican restaurant and had served me lunch the day the obituary arrived. The third was for Robert Chen, a rancher who I had interviewed for a story about cattle prices just 2 days earlier. All of the obituaries followed the same pattern. They contained detailed, specific information about the deaths, including medical details that seemed accurate and professional. They listed funeral arrangements at real funeral homes with realistic dates and times. Most disturbing, they were all dated exactly 7 days in the future from the date they arrived in my inbox. I started to suspect that someone was playing an elaborate prank or trying to cause panic in our small community. But the obituaries were too detailed and professional to be simple pranks. They read like genuine death notices, complete with medical terminology and procedural details that suggested the author had extensive knowledge of how people actually die and how death certificates are processed. On Thursday morning, exactly 7 days after I had received the first obituary submission, I received a phone call that made my blood run cold. Janet Morrison had suffered a massive heart attack Wednesday evening and had died at Sunset Valley General Hospital at exactly the time listed in the obituary I had received a week earlier. The details of her death matched the submitted obituary perfectly. The attending physicians, the cause of death, even the funeral arrangements that had already been made by her family. I immediately called the other 3 people who had been the subjects of the mysterious obituaries. Tom Bradley answered his phone and seemed fine. Maria Santos was working at her restaurant as usual. Robert Chen was out checking on his cattle but called me back within an hour. All 3 were alive and healthy. But I knew that based on the pattern with Janet Morrison, they each had less than a week to live. I faced an impossible decision. Should I warn these people that they might be in danger? Should I contact the police about what appeared to be some form of threat or prediction? Or would I sound insane trying to explain that I was receiving advance notice of people's deaths through fake obituary submissions? I decided to start by investigating the source of the obituaries. The emails had all come from an address I didn't recognize. Using a generic webmail service that didn't require identity verification, the IP addresses were masked through proxy servers, making it impossible to trace the actual sender. Whoever was submitting these obituaries was taking extensive precautions to remain anonymous. I also began researching similar cases online, trying to find other instances of people receiving advance obituaries or death predictions. What I found was more disturbing than helpful. There were scattered reports from other small towns of newspapers receiving mysterious obituaries for living people. But in every case I could verify, the obituaries had eventually proven accurate. Friday morning brought another obituary submission. This one for my own assistant, Rebecca Walsh, a 28-year-old single mother who had been helping me with the newspaper for about 6 months. According to the obituary, Rebecca would die in a car accident the following Friday evening on Mountain Road, the same dangerous stretch of highway where several people had died over the years. I couldn't remain silent any longer. I called Rebecca into my office and showed her the obituary submission. She was understandably upset and frightened, but she agreed that we needed to contact the sheriff's department immediately. Sheriff Martinez listened to our story with skepticism. But Janet Morrison's death, exactly as predicted, had already caught his attention. Over the weekend, I received 2 more obituary submissions, one for Tom Bradley and one for Maria Santos, both scheduled to die within the next few days. The details were again specific and professional, describing Tom's death from a farming accident and Maria's death from an allergic reaction to medication she had never taken before. By Monday morning, I was barely functioning. I was checking on all the people mentioned in the obituaries multiple times per day, trying to convince them to be extra careful about their safety without explaining the full situation. I had started keeping copies of all the obituary submissions, documenting the pattern and trying to find connections between the victims. Tuesday brought the most terrifying development yet. I received an obituary submission for myself. According to the detailed death notice, I would die of injuries sustained in a fall down the stairs at my office building the following Tuesday evening. The obituary described my death with the same clinical precision as all the others, including details about the investigation and my funeral arrangements. The submission of my own obituary forced me to confront the reality of what was happening. Someone in Sunset Valley had the ability to predict deaths with perfect accuracy. And they were using the newspaper's obituary system to announce these deaths in advance. Whether they were causing the deaths or simply predicting them, I now had exactly 1 week to live. I spent the next few days trying to identify the source of the obituaries and prevent my own predicted death. I avoided the stairs in my building, worked from home when possible, and had Sheriff Martinez increase patrols around my office and residence. But I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever force was behind these predictions would find a way to make them come true, regardless of the precautions I took. On the Tuesday evening when I was supposed to die, I was sitting in Sheriff Martinez's office under protective supervision when we received word that Tom Bradley had been killed in a farming accident, exactly as his obituary had predicted. The pattern was continuing, and I realized that my death was simply postponed, not prevented. Wednesday morning brought a new obituary submission, this one predicting my death for the following Tuesday. The location and cause were different, but the outcome was the same. Whoever was sending these obituaries would continue until they achieved their goal. I'm sharing this story because I believe the obituary submissions will continue, and other people in Sunset Valley are going to die exactly as predicted. I don't know who is behind this or how they're able to predict deaths with such accuracy, but I know that my time is running out. If something happens to me, I hope this account will help someone else understand what's happening in our town and maybe find a way to stop it. If you found this story disturbing and want to hear more real horror experiences from people just like you, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell. Your support helps me bring you the most chilling true stories from small towns across America.